The marble floor of First National Bank in Cleveland carried every word Alan Redford threw across the lobby. "You're useless, Jillian." The loan officer had barely finished explaining the denial when Alan turned on his pregnant wife. In front of the waiting line, the branch manager and two silent customers who suddenly had nowhere to look. "If you can't even get a loan approved," he said coldly, "you don't belong in my house." Jillian Redford didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, one hand resting quietly over the child Alan had already decided was a burden. What Alan didn't know, what no one in that lobby knew, was that the balance of power had already begun to shift. And it would begin with a phone call he had never imagined. If you believe dignity matters more than pride, stay with this story until the end. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Stories like this remind us that truth can take time, but it always leaves a record. And if you value stories about quiet strength and justice that unfold slowly, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. In the quiet suburbs west of Cleveland, where identical mailboxes lined narrow streets and lawns were trimmed with careful routine, Jillian Redford had built a life defined not by noise, but by order. The house on Willow Creek Drive looked like any other modest suburban home. Beige siding, a maple tree that turned copper every October. A porch light Jillian turned on at precisely the same time every evening. Neighbors saw a normal marriage. They saw Alan Redford leaving early in a pickup truck bearing the logo Redford Structural Services, a small construction subcontracting company he had built over 8 years. They saw Jillian leaving later, walking carefully to her sedan, carrying a canvas bag filled with folders from the Cleveland Community Health Center, where she worked as an administrative coordinator. They saw a couple preparing for a baby. What they did not see was how the balance inside that house had been shifting for months. Jillian Redford was not a loud person. She had never been. At 32, she had the calm patience of someone who understood that most things in life could be managed with careful attention. Her desk at the health center was known for its order, labeled folders, clean spreadsheets, and a small leather notebook she used to record details others often forgot. Dates, phone numbers, notes from conversations. It was a habit she had developed years earlier, first during college, then in every job she had held since. Writing things down helped her make sense of complicated situations. Alan used to tease her about it. Planning to write a novel someday, he had joked once, watching her jot something into the notebook during dinner. Jillian had smiled quietly. "No," she said, "just keeping track." In the early years of their marriage, Alan's teasing had been lighthearted. He had admired Jillian's steadiness then. Alan Redford had always been a man who moved quickly. At 36, he spoke with the confident rhythm of someone used to negotiating contracts and persuading clients. His company specialized in structural framing for commercial projects, warehouses, office renovations, small retail buildings. It wasn't a large company, but it was enough to support a comfortable life. Or at least it had been. Over the past 2 years, Alan's ambitions had grown larger than the contracts his company typically handled. He wanted expansion, more crews, bigger equipment, a warehouse space for materials. He had begun talking about these plans almost every evening. "We're sitting on opportunity," Alan would say, spreading blueprints across the kitchen table. "All we need is the capital to scale." Jillian Redford listened. She often asked careful questions. How much would the loan be? What would the monthly payments look like? Would we need to hire new staff immediately? Alan usually answered with broad confidence rather than specifics. "Banks love growth," he would say. "They just need to see momentum." And momentum in Alan's mind required one more thing: Jillian's credit. While Alan's business accounts carried the normal debts of a growing company: equipment leases, supply lines, contractor insurance. Jillian's personal credit history was nearly spotless. She had always paid bills early. Her student loans were already reduced to a small balance. Even their mortgage payments had mostly been scheduled through her careful budgeting. One evening in early spring, Alan finally asked the question directly. They were sitting in the kitchen. Outside rain tapped lightly against the windows. "I need you to co-sign the expansion loan," Alan said. Jillian looked up from her notebook. "How large is the loan?" "Just under $300,000. Her pen paused. "That's a significant amount." "It's an investment," Alan replied quickly. 3 new crews alone could double our revenue." Jillian rested her hand gently over her stomach. 5 months pregnant. The small movement beneath her palm reminded her that every decision now carried a different weight. "Will the bank require both our financial histories?" she asked. "Standard process," Alan said. "But with your credit score attached, approval should be straightforward." He said it with such certainty that the conversation seemed almost finished before it began. Jillian did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked one more question. "Have you reviewed all outstanding debts in the business accounts?" Alan gave a short laugh. "Of course. I run the company, Jill." It was not an answer. But Jillian nodded slowly. Over the following weeks, she gathered the documents the bank required. Tax returns, credit reports, income verification from her position at the health center. Alan handled the business paperwork separately. He often worked late in his home office. The door closed while spreadsheets glowed on his computer screen. When Jillian asked how things were progressing, he usually responded with quick reassurance. "Everything's under control." The loan appointment was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at First National Bank, one of Cleveland's larger regional lenders. Loan officer Mark Caldwell had reviewed their preliminary application and requested a formal meeting. In the days leading up to that meeting, Jillian continued her normal routine. Work at the health center, doctor appointments for prenatal checkups, quiet evenings preparing the spare bedroom that would soon become a nursery. Alan, meanwhile, grew increasingly restless. His phone rang more often. Sometimes he stepped outside to take calls. Other times he lowered his voice and spoke quickly in his office. Jillian noticed these things the way she noticed everything. But she did not confront him, not yet. Instead, she wrote small notes in her leather notebook. Monday evening, the night before the bank meeting, Alan seemed unusually tense. He paced the kitchen while Jillian washed dishes. "This loan changes everything," he said. "Once we secure it, the company moves to a completely different level." Jillian dried her hands with a towel. "What if the bank has concerns?" she asked gently. Alan stopped pacing. "They won't. But if they do," his expression hardened slightly, "then we explain. That's how business works." Jillian nodded. Still, something in Alan's tone felt different from the confidence he usually displayed. It carried a sharper edge, as though he were already preparing for a challenge that had not yet appeared. Later that night, after Alan had gone to bed, Jillian remained at the kitchen table. The house was quiet. Outside, the streetlights cast pale circles across the sidewalk. She opened her notebook again. Under the date, she wrote a simple line. "Loan meeting, First National Bank, Tuesday, 9:00 a.m. Then she paused. For a moment, her hand rested again over her stomach. The child shifted slightly beneath her palm. Jillian closed the notebook. Tomorrow, she believed, would be a routine step in Alan's business plans. A meeting, a signature, perhaps a discussion about repayment schedules, nothing more. What she did not yet know was that the meeting scheduled for 9 o'clock the next morning would end something far larger than a loan application. It would end her marriage, and it would begin a chain of events that Alan Redford could never have predicted. The lobby of First National Bank in downtown Cleveland carried a quiet kind of formality. Tall windows allowed pale morning light to spill across the marble floor. The faint sound of printers and keyboards drifted from behind the teller counters. A television mounted high on the wall displayed financial news in muted silence while customers waited in orderly lines. At 8:57 a.m., Jillian Redford and Alan Redford walked through the glass doors. Alan moved first, shoulders straight, the brisk confidence of someone accustomed to presenting himself as successful. He wore a navy blazer over a pale blue shirt, the sleeves slightly rolled at the wrists, as though he had somewhere more important to be. Jillian walked beside him more slowly. Her pregnancy showed now in the gentle curve beneath her coat. One hand rested instinctively against her side as she moved across the polished floor. She carried a slim folder containing the documents she had prepared: pay stubs, tax records, credit verification. Every page carefully arranged. A receptionist directed them toward a glass-walled office near the back of the lobby. Inside waited Mark Caldwell, the loan officer who had been reviewing their application. Mark was in his early 40s with the composed patience of someone who had spent years explaining financial realities to hopeful applicants. A tablet and several printed documents rested neatly on the desk in front of him. Beside him sat Linda Parker, the branch manager. Her presence alone suggested that the meeting had become more complicated than a standard loan review. Alan noticed it immediately. "Morning," he said with a practiced smile, extending his hand. "Alan Redford." Mark stood and shook it politely. "Good morning, Mr. Redford." "And Mrs. Redford?" Jillian nodded quietly as she took the chair across the desk. For a moment, everything seemed ordinary. The door closed softly. Outside customers moved past the glass walls without paying attention. Mark opened the file. "Thank you both for coming in today," he began. "We've completed a full review of your application for the business expansion loan requested by Redford Structural Services." Alan leaned back in his chair. "Great. I'm looking forward to moving ahead." Mark paused. It was a small pause, but Jillian noticed it. Loan officers learn to control their expressions, but sometimes silence spoke more clearly than words. Mark folded his hands. "Unfortunately, after reviewing the financial documentation provided, the bank will not be able to approve the loan request at this time." For a brief moment, the room became completely still. Alan blinked. "I'm sorry," what Mark's tone remained professional. "The application contains several inconsistencies related to outstanding liabilities. Based on the current debt-to-income ratios, the risk assessment does not meet our lending requirements." Alan leaned forward sharply. "That doesn't make sense." Linda Parker spoke calmly. "There are additional lines of credit associated with the business that were not fully explained in the original submission." Alan's eyes flickered briefly toward Jillian. Then his posture changed. It was subtle at first, a tightening of his jaw, a slight shift in his shoulders. Jillian had seen that posture before. It meant Alan had already decided where the blame would go. "Well," Alan said slowly, "that's probably because the financial picture was incomplete." Mark frowned slightly. "Could you clarify what you mean by that?" Alan turned his head toward Jillian. For a moment, he simply stared at her, saying when he spoke, "You handled the personal credit portion of this application, didn't you?" Jillian looked at him calmly. "Yes. The personal credit documents were submitted exactly as requested." Alan let out a sharp breath through his nose. "That's what I thought." Mark glanced between them. "Mr. Redford, the concerns we identified relate primarily to business liabilities." But Alan was no longer listening to Mark. He was looking only at Jillian now. "I told you to make sure everything was clean," he said quietly. Jillian's voice remained steady. "I submitted the documents exactly as the bank requested." Alan's chair scraped slightly against the floor as he shifted forward. Well, clearly something went wrong. Mark spoke again, his tone firmer. "The discrepancies are connected to business accounts, Mr. Redford. Mrs. Redford's personal credit file is actually very strong." But Alan had already decided on a different narrative. Sometimes a person protects their pride by rewriting reality faster than truth can speak. Alan laughed once, a short sound that carried no humor. Incredible. He looked back at Jillian. "You couldn't even get the paperwork right." The accusation hung in the air. Jillian did not respond. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Outside the office, a customer walking past slowed slightly, sensing tension behind the glass. Mark tried once more. "Mr. Redford, the loan decision is based on several financial ratios." That Alan raised his hand abruptly. "No, I understand exactly what happened." He leaned closer to Jillian. "This was your responsibility." Jillian finally spoke. "My responsibility was submitting the personal documents the bank requested. I did that." Alan shook his head slowly, as though disappointed by something obvious. "You always miss the bigger picture." Mark's voice carried a hint of discomfort now. "Mr. Redford, perhaps we should review the specific financial concerns together." Alan stood up. The sudden movement caused his chair to slide back with a harsh sound against the floor. "No," he said coldly. "I've seen enough." For a moment his eyes moved around the room. Mark Caldwell, Linda Parker, two customers now openly watching through the glass wall. Then his gaze returned to Jillian. "You know what the worst part is?" Alan said. His voice was not loud, but the quiet sharpness carried farther than shouting. "I trusted you to help this family." The words seemed carefully chosen, each one placed like a small blade. Jillian remained seated. Alan continued, "You had one job in this process." He gestured toward the file on Mark's desk. "And now the entire expansion is dead." Mark attempted to interrupt. "That's not an accurate summary of the situation," Alan ignored him. He was speaking only to Jillian now. "If you can't even support your own husband's business," he said, "what exactly are you contributing?" The question echoed in the small office. Through the glass wall, the bank lobby had grown noticeably quieter. Linda Parker's expression hardened slightly. Jillian slowly stood. She did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself. Instead, she simply looked at Alan. Her gaze was calm, observant, almost distant. That calmness seemed to irritate Alan even more. "You know what," he said abruptly. "If you're going to sabotage everything, don't bother coming home tonight." Mark's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Redford," Alan cut him off again. "No, I'm serious." He pointed toward the door. "If you can't help this family, you don't belong in my house." The words settled into the room like cold air. No one spoke. Jillian stood still for a moment. Then she picked up her folder from the desk. She nodded once toward Mark Caldwell. "Thank you for your time." Her voice remained soft, professional, as though the meeting had been nothing more than routine business. Mark looked at her, clearly uneasy. "I'm sorry this meeting was difficult, Mrs. Redford." Jillian gave a small, polite nod. Then she turned and walked toward the door. Alan did not follow immediately. He remained standing beside the desk, breathing slowly, as though convincing himself that what he had just done was justified. Through the glass wall, customers pretended to examine brochures while listening. Jillian stepped back into the bank lobby. The marble floor felt colder than before. She walked past the waiting chairs, past the silent television, past the reception desk. No one spoke to her. No one stopped her. But several people watched. Behind her, Alan's voice could still be heard faintly through the glass. Sharp, defensive, arguing with Mark Caldwell. Jillian reached the front doors and stepped outside into the morning air. The city noise of downtown Cleveland rushed back in traffic-distant horns, the hum of buses. For a moment, she stood on the sidewalk. Her hand rested gently over her stomach again. Inside the bank, Alan Redford believed he had just defended his pride. He believed he had identified the cause of his failure. What he did not yet understand was that the truth about that loan and about everything else in his life was already recorded in places he had never bothered to check. And before long, those records would begin to speak. The drive back from downtown Cleveland took nearly 30 minutes. Alan Redford drove. Jillian sat in the passenger seat, the folder from the bank resting quietly in her lap. Neither of them spoke. Traffic moved slowly along Interstate 90, the morning commuters forming long lines of steel and glass beneath the pale gray sky. Alan's hands gripped the steering wheel more tightly than usual, his jaw rigid as he stared forward. Every few minutes, he exhaled sharply. Once, he muttered something under his breath. Jillian did not ask what he had said. She watched the road pass by through the window, the rhythm of highway signs and passing exits, giving the silence a steady structure. Her mind replayed the meeting in the bank office with the same careful attention she used whenever something important happened. Mark Caldwell's explanation, Linda Parker's expression, Alan's reaction, the exact moment his tone shifted, the sentences he chose. She remembered them all. When the truck finally turned onto Willow Creek Drive, the neighborhood looked unchanged from that morning. The same mailboxes, the same quiet sidewalks. Mrs. Bennett from across the street was watering the flower beds near her driveway. She waved politely as Alan pulled into the garage. Alan did not wave back. He stepped out of the truck immediately and walked toward the front door without waiting for Jillian. Inside, the house felt unusually still. The kitchen still carried the faint smell of coffee from earlier that morning. Jillian placed her folder gently on the counter while Alan paced the room. "This is unbelievable," he said. He ran a hand through his hair. "That bank doesn't know what they're doing." Jillian removed her coat and hung it carefully on the rack beside the door. Alan continued pacing. 3 months of planning, he said. 3 months preparing this expansion. His voice grew sharper. "And it collapses because the paperwork wasn't handled properly." Jillian turned slowly toward him. The loan officer said the issue involved business liabilities. Alan stopped pacing. For a moment, he stared at her as if the words themselves were offensive. "That's what they said," he replied. "Yes, but that doesn't mean it's accurate." Well, Jillian did not argue. She had already learned that Alan often treated facts as negotiable if they threatened his sense of control. Instead, she asked quietly, "Did the bank mention which liabilities?" Alan scoffed. They threw around a few vague numbers, nothing that should have stopped the approval. He walked to the refrigerator and opened it, though he did not seem interested in anything inside. "What matters," he continued, "is that the meeting made me look incompetent." The refrigerator door closed with a dull thud. Jillian watched him carefully. "It was a difficult conversation," she said. Alan laughed once. "A difficult conversation? He leaned against the counter. "That wasn't difficult. That was humiliating." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And you didn't help." Jillian remained calm. "I answered the questions they asked." "That's exactly the problem," Alan said. He pointed toward the folder on the counter. "You treat everything like paperwork." Jillian said nothing. Alan stepped closer. "You don't understand how business works, Jillian." His voice dropped lower now. "Sometimes you have to control the narrative." The sentence hung quietly in the kitchen. Jillian noticed it immediately. Control the narrative. She stored the phrase in her memory. Alan sighed heavily and rubbed his temples. "Well," he said finally, "there's only one way to deal with this." Jillian waited. Alan straightened. "You should stay somewhere else for a while." The words arrived without warning. For a moment, even the refrigerator hum seemed to pause. Jillian looked at him. "Somewhere else?" "Yes," Alan spoke as though explaining something obvious. "This house is tied to my business reputation. Right now, everything needs to look stable." Jillian's hand rested lightly on the edge of the counter. "And how does my leaving help?" That Alan shrugged. "You've already created enough doubt." The accusation carried no hesitation. Jillian studied his face. "You believe the bank denied the loan because of me." Alan folded his arms. "I believe your involvement complicated the process." The difference between those two sentences was small, but it was enough. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Alan pushed away from the counter and walked toward the hallway. He returned a moment later carrying a small suitcase. He set it on the kitchen table. "You can take this." Jillian looked at the suitcase. It was the same one they had used on a weekend trip to Chicago the year before. "You're serious," she said. Alan met her gaze without hesitation. Yes. Jillian did not cry. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she walked upstairs. The bedroom felt strangely peaceful compared to the tension downstairs. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The half-finished nursery across the hall stood open, soft yellow paint on the walls, and a small crib still waiting to be assembled. Jillian stood there for a moment. Then she returned to the bedroom and began placing a few items into the suitcase. Clothes, her notebook, her laptop, a folder containing personal documents. She moved slowly, deliberately, each motion precise. Downstairs, she could hear Alan pacing again. When she returned to the kitchen 20 minutes later, the suitcase rolled quietly behind her. Alan barely looked up. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. "I'll find somewhere." "Good." He walked toward the front door and opened it. The afternoon air drifted inside. Mrs. Bennett across the street was still tending her flowers. Jillian lifted the suitcase handle. As she stepped outside, Alan spoke once more. "Jillian," she paused. "If you're going to stay somewhere else," he said, "don't create unnecessary drama." Jillian looked at him. "I won't." That answer seemed to satisfy him. He closed the door. The quiet click of the latch echoed faintly in the afternoon air. Jillian stood on the porch for a moment. Then she walked toward her car. The suitcase fit easily in the trunk. She sat in the driver's seat and closed the door. Inside the car, the world felt strangely calm. Her hands rested on the steering wheel. For a long moment, she did not start the engine. Instead, she opened her leather notebook. Under the date, she began writing. Loan meeting, 9:00 a.m. First National Bank. She recorded Alan's exact words, every sentence she could remember, every reaction from the people in the room. Then she turned to a new line, 4:15 p.m. Alan asked me to leave the house. Another pause. Her pen moved again. Statement. If you can't help this family, you don't belong in my house. Jillian closed the notebook. Then she started the car. 20 minutes later, she checked into a small roadside building called Maple Grove Motel, a quiet place just off the highway where travelers rarely stayed longer than a night. The room was simple. A bed, a small desk, a narrow window facing the parking lot. Jillian placed her suitcase beside the desk. She sat down slowly. Outside, the evening light faded into soft orange shadows. For the first time that day, the silence felt complete. She opened her notebook again. More details, more sentences, precise, careful, recorded. Nearly an hour passed before her phone vibrated on the desk. A voicemail notification. The number was unfamiliar. Jillian listened. A calm male voice spoke clearly. "Good evening, Miss Redford. My name is Daniel Harper. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Redford." There was a short pause. "I'm calling regarding a matter that requires your attention. Please contact my office at your earliest convenience." The message ended. Jillian listened to it once more. Margaret Redford, her aunt, a woman she had not spoken to in nearly 5 years. Jillian set the phone down slowly. Across town, Alan Redford believed he had removed the complication from his life. He believed the problem had been solved. What he did not know was that the voicemail Jillian had just received would soon alter the entire balance of that problem. Oh, and when the truth finally unfolded, the house on Willow Creek Drive would no longer belong to the future Alan imagined. The voicemail sat quietly on Jillian Redford's phone, long after the small desk lamp in the Maple Grove motel room had flickered on. Outside the narrow window, the evening traffic along the highway had begun to thin. A soft hum of passing cars came and went in distant waves. Jillian replayed the message once more. "My name is Daniel Harper. I'm an attorney representing the estate of Margaret Redford." The name carried a faint echo of another life. Margaret Redford had been Jillian's father's older sister. When Jillian was a child, Margaret had lived in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in a quiet adobe house surrounded by juniper trees and red desert hills. For several summers, Jillian had visited her there. Those visits had always felt different from the rest of her childhood. Margaret was not a loud woman, but she possessed a calm certainty that made people listen when she spoke. She collected books about art history and architecture. Her house was filled with journals, sketches, and the soft smell of cedar shelves. Most of all, Margaret had paid attention. She noticed things other adults overlooked. When Jillian was 14 and struggling with mathematics homework at the kitchen table, Margaret had placed a notebook in front of her. "Write the problem down first," she had said. "I already see the problem," Jillian replied. Margaret shook her head gently. Seeing something and recording it are not the same thing. She tapped the notebook. If you write clearly, the truth can't change later. It had been a small lesson, but Jillian had never forgotten it. As she grew older, life slowly pulled them apart. College, work, marriage. Margaret remained in Santa Fe while Jillian built her life in Ohio. Phone calls became less frequent over the years. Holiday cards arrived sometimes in December, written in Margaret's precise handwriting. The last time they had spoken was nearly 5 years earlier. Now there was a voicemail. An estate attorney. Jillian placed the phone on the desk and looked at the number again. It was late in Ohio. But in New Mexico, it would still be early evening. She pressed the call button. The line rang twice before someone answered. Harper and Collins Estate Law. This is Daniel Harper speaking. His voice matched the one from the voicemail, measured professional patient. "Mr. Harper," Jillian said softly, "this is Jillian Redford returning your call." There was a brief pause. "Miss Redford, thank you for contacting me." His tone carried a quiet seriousness that immediately told her the matter was not trivial. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your Aunt Margaret Redford," he continued. Jillian held the phone closer. "What happened? I'm sorry to inform you that Miss Redford passed away 3 weeks ago." The words arrived calmly without unnecessary dramatics. Jillian closed her eyes for a moment. "I see. She died peacefully at her home in Santa Fe," Daniel Harper said. Her physician confirmed natural causes. She was 74. Jillian let out a slow breath. Margaret had always seemed timeless in her memory. The idea that she was gone felt strangely distant, like the closing of a book she had not realized was still being written. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jillian said. "She spoke about you often in recent years," Harper replied. That sentence surprised her slightly. "Did she?" "Yes. In fact, that is the reason I contacted you." Jillian leaned back in the motel chair. "My understanding," Harper continued, "is that you are Margaret Redford's closest living relative." Jillian thought for a moment. "My father passed away 12 years ago. Margaret had no children." "That is correct." Harper shuffled papers on his end of the line. "Your aunt left a will, and according to that document, you are named as the primary beneficiary of her estate." The words were delivered in the same calm tone he had used from the beginning, but their meaning was suddenly much larger. Jillian sat up slightly. "I wasn't aware she had included me. She was very specific in her instructions." Jillian hesitated. "I'm not sure what the estate involves." "That is understandable," Harper replied, "which is why we will need to schedule a formal review." He continued explaining carefully. Margaret's estate included several assets that would require legal processing before distribution. A residential property in Santa Fe investment accounts, a trust structure designed to manage certain long-term holdings. Jillian listened quietly. The details were complex, but Harper explained them with steady clarity. "This process does not require you to travel immediately," he said. "We can conduct the initial review through a secure video meeting. Later, if necessary, you may visit Santa Fe to review property matters." Jillian glanced around the motel room. The modest bed, the thin curtains, her suitcase resting beside the desk. The contrast between this space and the conversation she was having felt almost surreal. "I understand," she said. "May I ask when you are available for a meeting?" Jillian considered. Tomorrow she would normally return to the health center. But tomorrow also carried the quiet reality that she no longer had a home to return to afterward. Tomorrow afternoon would be possible, she said. Excellent, Harper replied. I'll send you a secure link along with several documents to review beforehand. He paused slightly. There is one more thing I should mention. Yes, Margaret Redford updated her will approximately 2 years ago. Jillian Sazoyan listened. In that update, Harper continued she included a letter addressed specifically to you. Jillian felt something shift quietly in her chest. A letter, yes. She instructed that it be delivered to you when the estate review begins. Jillian nodded slowly. I'd like to read it. I believe she expected that. They finalized the time for the meeting. After the call ended, the room returned to silence. Jillian placed the phone down again. Outside the window, the last traces of sunlight had faded. She opened her notebook. A new page. 8:42 p.m. phone call from Daniel Harper. Below it, she wrote, Margaret Redford passed away 3 weeks ago. Another line followed, named primary beneficiary of estate. Her pen paused there. Jillian was not a person who rushed toward conclusions. Instead, she wrote the next line carefully. Estate review scheduled tomorrow, 2:00 p.m. video conference. She closed the notebook. Across the city, Alan Redford was sitting in the living room of the house on Willow Creek Drive. He believed the worst problem of his week had been the rejected loan. He believed the evening argument had solved the complication Jillian represented. He did not know that in a quiet motel room less than 10 miles away, a conversation had just taken place that would soon reshape every assumption he had made about power money and control. And he certainly did not know that the estate of Margaret Redford contained far more than sentimental family property. In less than 24 hours, Jillian Redford would learn the true scale of what her aunt had left behind. And when that knowledge arrived, the balance of their story would begin to change in ways Alan could never reverse. The next afternoon arrived quietly. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of room 12 at Maple Grove Motel, spreading pale rectangles across the small desk where Jillian Redford had arranged her laptop notebook and a cup of untouched tea. At exactly 1:55 p.m., she opened the email Daniel Harper had sent earlier that morning. The subject line read, Secure Estate Conference. Margaret Redford. Jillian clicked the link. A moment later, the video screen appeared. First came Daniel Harper. He sat in what appeared to be a well-lit office lined with dark wooden bookshelves. His gray suit jacket rested neatly over the back of his chair as he adjusted his glasses and nodded politely. Good afternoon, Miss Redford. Good afternoon. Soon another window opened beside him. A woman in her early 40s appeared wearing a simple navy blouse and thin silver-framed glasses. Daniel gestured toward her. This is Rachel Simmons, the estate accountant, assisting with Margaret Redford's financial records. Rachel smiled gently. Nice to meet you, Jillian. Jillian returned the nod. Thank you both for meeting with me. Daniel folded his hands on the desk. Before we review the details, I want to express my condolences again regarding your aunt. Margaret Redford was a remarkable client. She was precise in her planning and very clear about her wishes. Jillian felt a small, quiet warmth at that description. Yes, that sounded like Margaret. Your aunt updated her estate documents several times over the past decade, Daniel continued. The final revision occurred 2 years ago. Rachel turned slightly toward a folder in front of her. All financial records have been carefully organized, she said. Margaret believed in clarity. Again, that sounded exactly like her. Daniel looked back at the camera. Shall we begin? Jillian nodded. Daniel opened a document. Margaret Redford's estate consists of 3 primary components. He held up a sheet. First, her residence in Santa Fe. A photograph appeared on the shared screen. It showed a beautiful Adobe-style house with soft clay-colored walls and a wide veranda overlooking a stretch of desert hills. Jillian's breath caught slightly. She recognized it immediately. Margaret's house. The same place where she had spent those quiet summers as a teenager. Rachel spoke gently. The property was purchased by your aunt in 1998, and has been fully paid off for several years. Jillian studied the image. The juniper trees, the red earth, the same low stone wall she remembered sitting on, while Margaret explained how the desert sky changed color at sunset. Daniel continued. The second component is an investment portfolio your aunt maintained through a private financial firm in Albuquerque. Rachel adjusted her glasses and clicked to the next screen. Charts appeared. Numbers, account summaries, mutual funds, long-term bonds, several diversified investment accounts. Jillian's eyes moved slowly across the figures. Even without studying the details closely, the scale was obvious. This was not a modest retirement fund, Rachel explained calmly. Margaret invested consistently for over 30 years. Her portfolio benefited significantly from long-term market growth. Daniel glanced toward Jillian. Your aunt was financially conservative. She rarely withdrew from these accounts. Jillian nodded slowly. Margaret had always lived simply. She wore the same comfortable sweaters for years. Her house contained books, art supplies, and a few carefully chosen pieces of furniture. Nothing extravagant, Daniel continued. The third component of the estate is a trust structure your aunt established approximately 6 years ago. Rachel displayed another document. This trust holds several assets, including the investment accounts and certain property interests. Jillian leaned slightly closer to the screen. What does the trust do? Rachel explained. It protects the assets from unnecessary tax exposure and ensures controlled distribution. Daniel added gently, Margaret designed the trust specifically to provide long-term financial stability for you. The sentence settled quietly in the motel room. Jillian remained silent for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the meeting began. What is the total value of the estate? Daniel and Rachel exchanged a quick glance. Rachel answered carefully. Based on the most recent valuation, including the property and investment holdings. She paused briefly to confirm the number on the document. The estate is currently valued at approximately $6.8 million. The number did not echo loudly in the room. There was no dramatic reaction, no sudden gasp. Instead, Jillian simply sat very still. 6.8 million. The figure existed now as a quiet fact. Rachel continued explaining the breakdown. The Santa Fe property alone carried significant value due to rising real estate demand in the region. The investment accounts had grown steadily over decades. Margaret had never married. She had no children. She had spent her life quietly building a financial foundation few people ever noticed. And she had left nearly all of it to Jillian. Daniel spoke again. There are several legal steps required before the assets can transfer fully into your control. Jillian nodded slowly. What steps? We will begin with probate confirmation, Daniel said. After that, the trust will release specific funds according to Margaret's instructions. Rachel added, There are also tax considerations we will handle carefully. Jillian listened carefully. The conversation moved through legal details. Timelines, documentation, financial protection. Daniel eventually paused. There is one more item Margaret asked us to share with you. He reached toward a sealed envelope on his desk. This is the letter I mentioned yesterday. He opened it carefully. The paper inside was slightly yellowed. Margaret's handwriting appeared strong and clear across the page. Daniel began reading. Dear Jillian, if you are hearing this letter, it means my time here has ended, and the world is now asking you to carry forward with your own life. I want you to know something I observed quietly for many years. You are stronger than you believe. Strength does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it appears as patience, as careful observation, as the willingness to write things down and wait for truth to reveal itself. I watched your life from afar. I know you have chosen kindness more often than pride. That is a rare quality. The resources I leave behind are not meant to change who you are. They are meant to protect your freedom. Use them wisely. And remember, a calm mind sees what chaos tries to hide. With love, Margaret. Daniel lowered the letter slowly. For a moment, the three screens remained silent. Jillian's eyes were calm, but something deep within her had shifted. Not excitement, not shock, something steadier. Security. Daniel spoke gently. Your aunt cared about you deeply. Jillian nodded. I know. Rachel closed her folder. We will begin the legal process immediately. For now, I recommend keeping this information private. Jillian understood the importance of that advice immediately. Yes, she said. Very private. The meeting ended shortly afterward. The laptop screen returned to darkness. Jillian sat quietly in the motel room. The same modest space. The same small desk. But the future inside her mind now looked very different. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford still believed his greatest problem was a denied bank loan. He believed Jillian had left because she had no choice. He believed time would eventually force her to return. What he did not know was that at that very moment, the woman he had dismissed in a bank office now held control of a future far larger than anything his business plans had imagined. And Jillian Redford, as always, had written everything down. The morning after the estate meeting began, like most quiet mornings in Maple Grove Motel. A pale band of sunlight slipped through the curtains. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck reversed with a slow mechanical beep. The smell of weak coffee drifted faintly through the hallway. Jillian Redford woke early. Pregnancy had changed her sleep in small ways. She often woke before sunrise, now her mind moving gently through the quiet hours while the rest of the world remained still. For several minutes, she simply sat on the edge of the bed. $6.8 million. The number from yesterday's meeting did not replay in her mind with excitement or disbelief. Instead, it existed as a quiet reality, something that required careful handling rather than celebration. Margaret had always believed money was a tool, not an identity. Jillian carried that same instinct. Her first thought that morning was not about wealth. It was about protection. She walked to the small desk, opened her laptop, and began reviewing the documents Daniel Harper had sent overnight. Legal outlines, trust structure details, preliminary probate filings. Every page reinforced the same fact: Margaret had built the estate deliberately to ensure long-term stability. Rachel Simmons had also included a short message. Recommendation: do not discuss the estate publicly until legal transfer is complete. Jillian agreed completely. She opened her leather notebook. A fresh page. 8:05 a.m. estate valuation confirmed approx. $6.8 million. Below it, she wrote another line. Primary instruction privacy. Then she closed the notebook. There was another matter she wanted to examine before the day continued. Jillian opened a different folder on her laptop. Inside were the digital copies of financial records she had downloaded several weeks earlier while helping Alan prepare the loan application. At the time, she had reviewed them only briefly. Now she studied them carefully. Joint checking account statements, credit card summaries, mortgage payment history. Everything connected to the life she and Alan had built together. At first glance, nothing appeared unusual. Monthly expenses, insurance payments, utility bills. But Jillian had always believed that patterns told more truth than individual numbers. She began comparing dates. The bank loan application had required Alan to disclose the company's liabilities. Those liabilities should have matched the financial records she had seen while helping assemble the paperwork. But as she opened more files, something small caught her attention. A payment. $3,200. The description simply read, Transfer Commercial Account. The date was from 2 months earlier. Jillian scrolled further. Another transfer appeared the following week. $4,800. Same description, same destination account number. She frowned slightly. Alan had mentioned routine contractor payments during that period. But those payments normally appeared with vendor names attached. Concrete suppliers, equipment rentals, subcontractor wages. These transfers were different. They moved money quietly between accounts without explanation. Jillian opened the transaction details. The receiving account belonged to a financial institution she did not immediately recognize. She wrote the number down. Then she checked the following month's statement. 2 more transfers, $5,000, $2,000. The pattern repeated. Individually, the amounts might not have raised suspicion, but together they suggested something else. Hidden obligations. She leaned back slightly in her chair. If Alan had additional liabilities connected to these transfers, they would directly affect the debt-to-income ratio the bank had evaluated. Which meant something important. The loan might not have been denied because of her documents at all. It might have been denied because Alan had not disclosed certain debts. Jillian did not jump to conclusions. Instead, she opened a spreadsheet and began listing the transactions. Dates, amounts, account numbers, every detail recorded precisely. The process took nearly an hour. When she finished, the pattern was unmistakable. Over the past 6 months, nearly $30,000 had been transferred quietly from their joint accounts into the same unknown account. Jillian stared at the final number. $30,000. That amount alone would not collapse a loan application. But if it represented only a portion of undisclosed debt, the situation could become far more serious. Her phone vibrated softly on the desk. A text message appeared. "Alan, we should talk." Jillian read the message without reacting. Another message arrived moments later. "Alan, this situation yesterday got out of hand." She did not reply. Instead, she opened the email Mark Caldwell had sent after the meeting. It was brief and professional. Mrs. Redford. Following yesterday's meeting, I wanted to clarify that the loan decision was based primarily on inconsistencies within the business liability disclosures. Your personal credit record was not a factor in the denial. Please contact me if you require documentation for your records. Jillian read the message twice. Then she saved it in a new folder labeled Bank Correspondence. Another note appeared in her notebook. Loan denial confirmed business liabilities. She underlined the words once. Across town, Alan Redford was beginning his morning in the house on Willow Creek Drive. He stood in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring at his phone. Jillian had not responded. That irritated him more than the bank meeting itself. He typed another message. "Alan, we need to discuss what happens next." Still no reply. Alan sighed. In his mind, Jillian's silence meant she was upset, confused, perhaps waiting for him to calm down before returning home. That was how conflicts usually worked. One person pushed, the other retreated. Eventually, things returned to normal. He set the phone down. What Alan did not understand was that Jillian was no longer thinking about returning. She was thinking about documentation. Back at the motel, Jillian continued her review. She searched the unfamiliar account number online. Within seconds, the name of the financial institution appeared. Midwest Commercial Lending Group, a private lending firm, not a bank. Private lenders often issued short-term loans at higher interest rates when traditional banks declined. Jillian's eyes moved slowly across the screen. If Alan had taken a private loan recently, the bank would absolutely consider that a major liability, which raised another question. Had Alan disclosed that loan during the application process, the answer now seemed unlikely. Jillian wrote one more line in her notebook. Possible undisclosed debt, Midwest Commercial Lending Group. She closed the laptop. The room felt quiet again. Outside, the morning traffic had begun to grow louder. Jillian rested her hand gently over her stomach. The baby shifted slightly beneath her palm. A calm mind sees what chaos tries to hide. Margaret's words returned to her clearly now. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford believed the worst damage from yesterday's argument had already passed. He believed time would smooth things over. He believed Jillian would eventually return to the house he still considered entirely his. What he did not realize was that the woman he had dismissed in a bank office had already begun uncovering the financial truth behind the loan denial. And the deeper she looked, the more the story Alan had told everyone, including himself, was beginning to unravel. 2 days after Jillian Redford left the house on Willow Creek Drive, the morning inside First National Bank moved forward with the same steady rhythm it always had. Customers approached the tellers. Papers shuffled across desks. The quiet mechanical sound of printers and keyboards filled the background. Inside his office, Mark Caldwell sat reviewing several loan files from the previous week. But one file kept returning to the top of his thoughts. Redford Structural Services. Loan application. Mark leaned back slightly in his chair. He had worked in commercial lending for nearly 15 years. Over time, he had learned that numbers rarely told the entire story. People did. The meeting with Alan and Jillian Redford had not felt normal. The financial inconsistencies in the file had raised immediate concerns, but the behavior inside the room had raised even more. Mark remembered the moment clearly. Alan Redford shifting blame almost instantly. Jillian Redford sitting quietly listening, rather than arguing. It was the kind of contrast that stayed with a person long after the meeting ended. He opened the file again. The bank had rejected the loan primarily because of unexplained liabilities tied to the business accounts. Several credit obligations had appeared during the bank's verification process that were not included in Alan's original disclosure. That alone would normally be enough to halt an approval, but there was something else. Mark clicked through the internal verification report. A note from the bank's risk department appeared. External commercial lending inquiry detected. That meant Alan had recently contacted a private lender. Mark rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Private lenders often charged high interest rates. Businesses usually turned to them only when traditional financing became difficult. If Alan had already taken on a private loan, it would significantly increase the company's debt burden, which meant the application submitted to the bank had almost certainly been incomplete. Mark glanced toward the glass wall of his office. Across the lobby, Linda Parker, the branch manager, was speaking with a customer near the front desk. After a moment, he stood and walked toward her. "Linda," he said quietly. She finished the conversation and turned toward him. "Yes." Mark held the loan file loosely in his hand. "I've been reviewing the Redford application again." Linda's expression immediately showed recognition. That was the couple from Tuesday morning. "Yes, the meeting where the husband started blaming his wife." Mark nodded. Linda crossed her arms thoughtfully. That situation felt uncomfortable from the start. Mark lowered his voice slightly. "The verification report confirms that Mr. Redford likely has a private lending arrangement he didn't disclose." Linda frowned. That would explain the debt ratio discrepancy. Exactly. Linda glanced toward the front doors of the bank. Did the wife know about it? Mark shook his head slowly. "I don't think so." He paused. When I explained the denial, she looked genuinely surprised. Linda sighed quietly. "Well, the bank made the correct decision." "Yes," Mark said, "but the way he treated her—" Linda nodded again. "I remember." For a moment, both of them stood silently. Then Mark added, "She handled it with remarkable composure." Linda agreed. "I noticed that too." Across town, Jillian Redford was sitting inside the small cafe attached to Cleveland Community Health Center where she normally worked. She had taken the morning off, explaining only that she needed personal time. The cafe was nearly empty. A few nurses moved quietly between shifts, and the soft sound of a coffee grinder hummed behind the counter. Jillian sat at a corner table with her laptop open. She was reviewing the transaction list she had compiled the night before. The pattern was now very clear. Multiple transfers to the same external lender. Amounts that suggested ongoing repayment of a private loan. She opened a search window again and typed the lender's name. Midwest Commercial Lending Group. Several business directories appeared. Private commercial loans, short-term financing, interest rates significantly higher than traditional banks. Jillian read carefully. Then she wrote another note in her notebook. Possible hidden loan affecting bank decision. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from Alan. "Alan, why are you ignoring me?" She placed the phone face down on the table. Silence, she had learned, often revealed more truth than arguments ever could. Across the city, Alan sat in his office at Redford Structural Services. The building was a modest warehouse space near an industrial park. Framing materials were stacked along one wall and the smell of sawdust hung faintly in the air. Alan stared at his phone again. Still no response from Jillian. He pushed his chair back in frustration. "She'll come around," he muttered to himself. In his mind, the situation was temporary. Arguments happened in marriages. People said things they didn't mean. Eventually, reality forced everyone back to practical solutions. Alan believed Jillian would soon realize she had nowhere else to go. That belief allowed him to ignore the deeper problem forming quietly beneath the surface. Back at the cafe, Jillian opened another email. This one came from Rachel Simmons, the estate accountant. The message was brief. "Jillian, the initial legal filings for Margaret Redford's estate are now underway. Please remember to keep this information confidential until the transfer process is complete. Let me know if you have any questions." Jillian typed a short reply. "Thank you. I understand." She closed the laptop. The cafe window reflected her calm expression faintly against the morning light. Across the bank lobby downtown, Mark Caldwell was finishing his notes on the Redford file. For a moment, he hesitated. Then he opened a new email to Jillian. Redford subject, documentation clarification. He typed carefully, "Mrs. Redford. Following your request earlier this week, I wanted to confirm again that the denial of the loan application for Redford Structural Services was based entirely on business liability inconsistencies. Your personal financial records were not responsible for the decision. If you require any additional documentation for your records, please feel free to contact me." Mark read the message once more before sending it. He did not know exactly what situation Jillian Redford was facing now, but he suspected that information might matter more than she realized. Back in the cafe, Jillian's phone vibrated with the incoming email. She opened it slowly. After reading Mark Caldwell's message, she placed the phone down and wrote one more line in her notebook. Bank confirmation denial caused by Alan's liabilities. She underlined the sentence carefully. The truth was beginning to take shape. Quietly, document by document. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford still believed the story he had told in the bank office. He believed Jillian's mistake had cost him the loan. He believed time would restore his control over the situation. What he did not know was that witnesses were beginning to remember the meeting differently. Documents were beginning to clarify the financial truth. And Jillian Redford, patient, observant, and very careful with records, was slowly assembling the full picture of what had really happened. 3 evenings after the bank meeting, rain began falling over Cleveland just after sunset. The steady sound of water tapping against the windows of room 12 at Maple Grove Motel created a quiet rhythm inside the small space. Jillian Redford sat at the desk again, reviewing the growing folder of information she had gathered during the past several days. The process had become methodical. Documents, emails, transaction logs, notes written carefully in her leather notebook. Each piece alone meant little, but together they were beginning to outline a pattern. Alan had not been honest about the financial situation of his business. The bank's decision now made perfect sense. Jillian opened the folder labeled Bank Correspondence again. Mark Caldwell's email sat at the top. The confirmation was simple and direct. The loan had been denied because of undisclosed liabilities tied to Alan's business accounts. Not because of her. She had suspected this already, but confirmation mattered. Facts mattered. Margaret's voice echoed faintly in her memory. A calm mind sees what chaos tries to hide. Jillian leaned back slightly in the chair. Then her phone vibrated again. Another message from Alan. "Alan, we need to talk tonight." A second message followed immediately. "Alan, I'm serious, Jillian. This has gone far enough." She did not respond. Instead, she opened another folder on her laptop. This one contained several voicemail recordings, automatically backed up from her phone. She had not paid attention to them earlier in the week. But now, as she scanned the list, one file caught her attention. The timestamp read Tuesday, 11:48 a.m. That was less than 2 hours after the bank meeting. She clicked the audio file. Alan's voice filled the quiet motel room. At first, the recording was muffled, as though he had left the message quickly while walking somewhere. Then the sound grew clearer. "Jillian, call me back." There was a pause, a long breath. "I can't believe that meeting went like that." Another pause. His tone shifted slightly less controlled now. "You should have handled the paperwork better." Jillian listened silently. The recording continued. "You know how important this loan was. I told you that from the beginning." Footsteps echoed faintly in the background. Then Alan spoke again more quickly. "Look, the bank people don't understand how this business works. They see numbers and panic." A car door slammed somewhere in the background. Then came the sentence that made Jillian's hand stop moving over her notebook. "It's not like the Midwest loan is even a big deal." Jillian froze. The voicemail continued. "That lender is temporary. I just needed the money quickly before the bank approval came through." His voice dropped lower, irritated. "But now everything looks messy because you didn't manage the paperwork right." The message ended with a sharp click. Jillian replayed the voicemail. Once, then again. This time she listened even more carefully. It's not like the Midwest loan is even a big deal. Midwest Commercial Lending Group. The same lenders she had discovered in the bank transactions. Which meant something important. Alan had already taken a private loan before applying for the bank expansion loan. And he had never disclosed that debt to the bank. The implication was obvious. The bank's risk department would absolutely detect that liability during verification. Which explained the sudden debt ratio problem. Which explained the loan denial. And which meant Alan had blamed Jillian for something he himself had hidden. Jillian did not react emotionally. Instead, she opened a new folder on her laptop. She labeled it carefully, Evidence Loan Application. Inside it, she saved 3 items. The bank email from Mark Caldwell, the financial transaction records showing payments to Midwest Commercial Lending Group, and the voicemail recording. Her fingers paused for a moment above the keyboard. Then she renamed the audio file. Alan voicemail, undisclosed loan reference. She wrote another note in her notebook. Voicemail confirms private lender prior to bank application. The rain outside continued falling steadily. Across the city, Alan Redford sat alone, in the living room of the house on Willow Creek Drive. The television flickered quietly in front of him, though he was not watching it. His phone rested on the coffee table. Still no reply from Jillian. He had expected her to cool down by now, to call, to explain, to apologize for making the bank meeting worse than it needed to be. Instead, the silence had stretched for 3 days. Alan stood and walked to the kitchen. The house felt strangely empty. He opened the refrigerator, staring inside without interest. His mind replayed the meeting at the bank again. The loan officer, the branch manager, the quiet customers watching through the glass. The humiliation of hearing the word denied. Alan clenched his jaw. It should have gone differently. If the bank had simply approved the loan, none of the other problems would matter. The Midwest loan had only been temporary financing, a bridge. But the timing had become complicated. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. Jillian would come back eventually. She always had before. Meanwhile, in the motel room across the city, Jillian had already moved on to the next step. She opened the email Daniel Harper had sent earlier that afternoon. The message contained new legal updates regarding Margaret's estate. Most of the details concerned probate scheduling and trust transfer procedures. But near the bottom of the email, one line stood out. The first portion of the trust will become accessible within 30 days, once probate confirmation is finalized. Jillian read the sentence carefully. 30 days. She closed the laptop slowly. The room returned to silence. Her hand rested lightly over her stomach again. The baby moved gently beneath her palm. Outside, the rain had begun to slow. Alan Redford still believed the most important evidence in his life was the business plan sitting inside his office. He believed the future depended on loans, contracts, and construction schedules. What he did not know was that 3 small pieces of information were now quietly sitting in a folder on Jillian's laptop. A bank confirmation, a series of financial transfers, and his own recorded voice admitting the existence of a loan he had never disclosed. Individually, they were just documents. But together, they told a story. And stories once written clearly enough had a way of changing everything. A week passed after the meeting at First National Bank. Spring had begun to settle gently across Cleveland. The trees along Willow Creek Drive showed the first pale hints of green, and the cool wind that usually swept through the neighborhood had softened into warmer afternoons. Inside the house at the end of the street, Alan Redford was beginning to feel something he had not expected: unease. For the first few days after Jillian left, he had convinced himself that the silence meant very little. People needed time to calm down after arguments. That was normal. But now, an entire week had passed. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts to return home. And that silence had begun to feel different. Alan stood in the kitchen, staring down at his phone again. The last message he had sent Jillian remained unanswered. "Alan, we need to talk." The message sat there like a small accusation. He exhaled slowly and set the phone on the counter. The real problem, he told himself, was the loan. If the bank had simply approved it, none of the other complications would exist. But the denial had left his business in an uncomfortable position. The Midwest Commercial Lending Group loan was only supposed to last a few weeks. It had been a temporary bridge while he waited for the bank's expansion financing. Now the bank money was gone, and the private lender would expect repayment soon. Alan rubbed his temples. There were solutions. There were always solutions. But first, he needed Jillian to stop making the situation worse. He picked up the phone again. This time, he called. The line rang, once, twice. Then it went to voicemail. Alan did not leave a message. Instead, he ended the call and paced the kitchen. Across Cleveland, Jillian Redford was sitting inside the quiet reading room of the Cleveland Public Library. The tall windows of the building allowed soft afternoon light to spill across rows of wooden tables. A few students studied quietly in the corners, while the distant sound of turning pages created a calm rhythm in the large room. Jillian had chosen this place deliberately. Libraries were built for careful thinking. In front of her, several documents were spread across the table. The bank confirmation email, the transaction records showing the Midwest lender payments, the voicemail recording saved safely on her laptop. Each piece fit neatly into the same picture. Alan had taken a private loan. He had not disclosed it. The bank discovered it. The loan application failed, and he blamed her. Jillian wrote another line in her notebook. Loan denial timeline confirmed. She underlined the word timeline once. Then her phone vibrated. Alan's name appeared on the screen. She watched it ring. For a moment, she considered answering. But Daniel Harper's advice echoed clearly in her mind. Document communication. Avoid emotional conversations. The call ended. A moment later, a new message appeared. Alan, Jillian, this has gone far enough. She placed the phone face down on the table. A few minutes later, another message arrived. Alan, I'm willing to move past what happened. Jillian read that one slowly. Move past what happened. It was an interesting phrase. It suggested that Alan believed the conflict itself was the problem. Not the reason behind it. Not the truth hidden underneath it. She opened her notebook again. A new entry. Alan attempting reconciliation. Unclear motive. She paused. Then she added a second line, possibly related to financial pressure. Across the city, Alan stood outside his office building, staring at his phone again. Still nothing. He clenched his jaw. Fine. If Jillian wasn't going to answer calls, he would handle the situation another way. He typed a new message. Alan, I heard you've been talking to lawyers. He stared at the screen. No reply. Then he typed again. Alan, whatever this is, it's unnecessary. We're married. Across the library table, Jillian read the message quietly. The word unnecessary caught her attention. It suggested that Alan believed she had overreacted, that everything could still be returned to its previous shape. She opened the folder on her laptop labeled Evidence Loan Application. The voicemail file remained at the top. Alan's own voice. Admitting the Midwest loan existed before the bank meeting. Jillian closed the laptop again. Across the library hall, a clock chimed softly. 4:00 p.m. She packed the documents back into her folder. Then she walked outside. The afternoon air carried the faint smell of rain from the night before. As she reached the sidewalk, her phone rang again. Alan. This time she answered. Hello? Her voice was calm. Alan immediately began speaking. Finally. There was irritation in his tone, but also something else. Relief. We need to talk about what happened last week, he said. I'm listening. Alan hesitated for a moment, perhaps expecting a different reaction. Well, he said, clearing his throat, things got out of hand at the bank. Yes, I shouldn't have said some of those things. The apology sounded rehearsed. But the situation was complicated, he added quickly. The loan officers misunderstood some of the numbers. Jillian waited. Alan continued. The business is under pressure right now. You know that. Yes, that's why I need you to come home. The words came out more firmly. We can work through the financial side together. Jillian looked up at the cloudy sky above the library steps. And the things you said, Alan sighed. I told you those were said in frustration. You asked me to leave the house. That was temporary. Temporary? Another interesting word. Jillian spoke quietly. Alan, why did the bank discover a loan from Midwest Commercial Lending Group? The silence on the other end of the phone lasted nearly 5 seconds. When Alan spoke again, his voice sounded different. Careful. Where did you hear that it appeared in the transaction records? Another pause. That was a short-term arrangement, Alan said finally. Something I had to do to keep a project moving. Did you disclose it to the bank? Alan's tone sharpened slightly. Jillian, that's not the point. But it was the point. She said nothing. Alan tried a different approach. Look, the only thing that matters right now is fixing the situation. And how do you plan to do that? We get the business stable again, then we reapply for financing. And you need me for that. Yes. There it was. The truth had slipped through. Jillian understood now. Alan's sudden willingness to reconcile had very little to do with regret. It had everything to do with money. The silence between them stretched again. Finally, Jillian spoke. I'll think about it. Alan exhaled. Good. He sounded relieved again. Just come home, Jillian. We'll figure everything out. The call ended. Jillian lowered the phone slowly. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford believed he had just taken the first step toward restoring control of the situation. He believed Jillian would return. He believed the conversation had gone well. What he did not realize was that the woman standing quietly on the library steps now understood something he had hoped would remain hidden. His apology had not been about regret. It had been about need. And the balance of need between them had already begun to change. The next morning arrived with a pale gray sky over Cleveland. Jillian Redford sat near the window of room 12 at Maple Grove Motel, her notebook open on the small desk beside a cup of untouched coffee. Outside, a thin mist drifted across the parking lot, softening the outlines of passing cars. She had slept very little. Not because she felt anxious, but because her mind had been organizing the situation carefully, piece by piece. The phone call with Alan the day before had clarified something important. His apology had not been about understanding. It had been about leverage. He needed something. And Jillian had begun to understand exactly what that was. She turned to a new page in her notebook and wrote the date. Then she began listing the key points she now knew with certainty. 1. Alan obtained a private loan from Midwest Commercial Lending Group. 2. The loan existed before the bank application. 3. The liability was not disclosed to First National Bank. 4. Bank denied loan due to undisclosed liabilities. 5. Alan blamed Jillian publicly for the denial. She paused. Then she added one more line. 6. Alan now wants reconciliation after financial pressure increased. Jillian closed the notebook slowly. The facts themselves did not require anger. They simply required clarity. Her phone vibrated. An email from Daniel Harper appeared on the screen. She opened it. Subject: Estate Update. Margaret Redford. The message was brief but important. Jillian, the probate court in Santa Fe has confirmed receipt of the estate filing. The initial legal review should be completed within 2 weeks. Once that process concludes, the first trust disbursement will be released. Rachel Simmons and I will continue handling the documentation. Best regards, Daniel Harper. Jillian read the message twice. 2 weeks. The timeline was moving forward steadily. She placed the phone down and looked out the window again. Across town, Alan Redford was beginning his morning inside the warehouse office of Redford Structural Services. Stacks of construction plans covered the desk in front of him. His laptop screen displayed an email from Midwest Commercial Lending Group. The subject line was blunt. Payment reminder. Outstanding balance. Alan read the message with a tight expression. The private lender had been patient so far, but patience in private lending rarely lasted long. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead. If the bank loan had gone through, this debt would already be settled. Instead, the situation had become complicated. Alan opened his phone and reread the brief conversation with Jillian from the day before. She had not refused to come home, but she had not agreed either. That uncertainty irritated him. He typed a new message. Alan, I think we should meet today. He hesitated, then added another line. Alan, we need to make decisions together. The message sent. Back at the motel, Jillian read the text message several minutes later. She studied the words carefully. We need to make decisions together. The phrasing suggested partnership. But Jillian now understood that Alan's idea of partnership had always been conditional. She wrote another entry in her notebook, Alan requesting meeting possible financial motive. Then she replied, Jillian, where? The response came quickly, Alan, the house. Jillian stared at the message. The house on Willow Creek Drive. The place he had told her she no longer belonged. She typed a short response. Jillian, not the house. Several minutes passed. Then Alan replied, Alan, fine. Coffee shop on West Ridge Road. Noon. Jillian agreed. The meeting would be simple, a conversation. But she would approach it carefully. Across Cleveland, Alan arrived early at the small cafe on West Ridge Road. The place was quiet during late mornings, mostly serving commuters and a few remote workers. He chose a table near the window. When Jillian entered 15 minutes later, she noticed immediately that he had already ordered coffee for both of them. Alan stood. For a moment, his expression softened slightly when he saw her. Jillian. She nodded. Alan. They sat across from each other. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Finally, Alan cleared his throat. I'm glad you came. Jillian waited. Alan took a sip of his coffee. I've been thinking about everything that happened last week. Yes, I overreacted. The apology came quickly. You were under pressure, Jillian said calmly. Alan nodded. Exactly. That's what I've been trying to explain. He leaned forward slightly. The business situation is complicated right now. Jillian said nothing. Alan continued. The Midwest loan was temporary financing. Why didn't you disclose it to the bank? Alan's jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't finalized when we started the application. That isn't what your voicemail suggested. Alan froze. Voicemail. Jillian held his gaze calmly. The message you left the morning after the bank meeting. Alan leaned back in his chair. For a moment, his eyes searched her face, as if trying to measure how much she knew. It was just frustration, he said carefully. Jillian did not argue. Instead, she asked another question. How much do you currently owe Midwest Commercial Lending Group? Alan hesitated. That's business information. It affects our finances. The sentence hung quietly between them. Alan exhaled. Roughly $80,000. The number was larger than Jillian had expected. And when is it due soon? He rubbed his hands together. But that's why we need to solve this together. Jillian watched him carefully. How if we stabilize the business, we can refinance later? And you need my credit for that. Alan nodded. That would help. The honesty arrived almost accidentally. Jillian felt a quiet confirmation settle in her mind. The meeting at the bank had not been about partnership. It had been about access. Alan leaned forward again. I know things got ugly, he said, but we're still married. Jillian looked at him steadily. Yes. So let's move forward. The phrase sounded hopeful, but Jillian noticed something missing. Alan had not asked how she had managed during the past week. He had not asked where she was staying. He had not asked about the baby. His focus remained entirely on the business problem. Jillian folded her hands quietly on the table. I'm considering my options, she said. Alan nodded quickly. That's fair. He sounded relieved. Across the cafe, a barista began wiping down empty tables. Outside, traffic moved slowly along the road. Alan believed the conversation had gone well. He believed Jillian was beginning to return to the role he expected. What he did not realize was that Jillian had already begun building something much more powerful than an argument. Documentation, evidence, legal clarity, and very soon a financial independence he had never imagined possible. 3 days after the meeting at the cafe on West Ridge Road, the sky over Cleveland turned a clear, bright blue. Spring sunlight filled the quiet streets, warming the sidewalks, and the rows of modest homes scattered across the suburbs. For most people, it was an ordinary morning. For Jillian Redford, it was another day of gathering clarity. She sat once again at the small desk in room 12 of Maple Grove Motel. Her laptop opened several folders arranged neatly beside it. The process had become familiar now. Open a document, read it carefully, record what mattered. Jillian had never rushed decisions in her life, and she was not about to begin now. Her email inbox showed a new message from Rachel Simmons, the estate accountant. The subject line read, Financial Documentation, Margaret Redford Estate. Jillian opened it. Inside were several official statements confirming the current valuation of the trust accounts and investment portfolios Margaret had maintained. Rachel had added a short note. Jillian, attached are the official financial statements requested by the probate court. The estate value has been verified and approved for processing. Total current valuation, $6,812,450. Let me know if you have questions. Jillian read the number slowly. The exact figure was slightly higher than the preliminary estimate Rachel had mentioned during their first meeting. $6,812,450. She did not react outwardly. Instead, she saved the documents in a secure folder Daniel Harper had instructed her to maintain. Then she wrote a brief entry in her notebook. Estate valuation confirmed, $6,812,450. Beneath it, she added another line. Trust disbursement pending probate completion. She closed the notebook. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford was standing inside his office at Redford Structural Services, staring at a computer screen filled with emails. The message from Midwest Commercial Lending Group had grown more urgent. The subject lines now included phrases like, Payment required, immediate attention. Alan leaned back in his chair. The private lender had originally given him 60 days to repay the loan. 30 of those days had already passed. Without the bank financing, he had expected the numbers no longer worked smoothly. Alan opened another email. This one came from Gregory Shaw, the representative he had dealt with at Midwest Commercial Lending Group. The message was short. Mr. Redford, our records indicate that the outstanding balance on your commercial loan will require immediate repayment within the next 30 days unless alternative arrangements are made. Please contact our office to discuss next steps. Alan closed the message with a frustrated sigh. There were still options. He simply needed time. And that time in his mind depended on Jillian. Back at the motel, Jillian turned her attention to another matter. She had spent the previous evening reviewing more of the business documents Alan had left open on their shared home computer months earlier. She had downloaded copies then only because the bank required supporting information for the loan application. Now those files had become something else. Evidence. She opened one of the email archives Alan had stored on a shared cloud folder. The folder was labeled simply, Business Financing Inside. There were several conversations between Alan and different lenders. Most of them appeared ordinary. But one thread caught her attention. The sender's name read, Gregory Shaw, Midwest Commercial Lending Group. Jillian opened the thread. The earliest message dated back nearly 3 months. Gregory Shaw had written, Alan, we can approve the short-term financing you requested. However, this loan must be disclosed in any future banking applications. Jillian read the sentence again. Must be disclosed. She continued scrolling. Alan's reply appeared below. Understood. The bank financing will likely close within a few weeks anyway. The next message from Gregory Shaw followed quickly. Please confirm that your spouse is aware of this arrangement, as her financial records were included in the preliminary documentation you submitted. Jillian felt her hand pause on the laptop trackpad. She read Alan's reply carefully. My wife doesn't need to be involved in this step. The bank loan will cover everything soon. Jillian leaned back slowly in her chair. The meaning was clear. Alan had knowingly taken the private loan. He had been told it needed to be disclosed, and he had deliberately chosen not to inform her, which meant something even more important. He had known from the beginning that the bank application would contain incomplete financial information, and yet he had still blamed her when the bank discovered it. Jillian copied the email thread and saved it inside the Evidence Loan Application folder. She renamed the file, Email Midwest Lender Disclosure Requirement. Then she opened her notebook again. A new entry, Email confirmation Alan aware private loan must be disclosed. Another line followed. Alan intentionally withheld information. She underlined the final sentence. Across the city, Alan Redford was pacing again inside his office. His phone buzzed on the desk. This time the message came from a familiar contact, Tom Whitaker. Tom had been one of the people waiting in the bank lobby the morning the loan was denied. The message read, Tom heard things didn't go well at First National. Everything okay? Alan frowned. He had not realized how quickly the story had begun spreading. He typed a quick reply. Alan, just a misunderstanding with paperwork, getting sorted out. Tom responded quickly. Tom, sorry to hear it. Hope things work out with Jillian too. That looked rough. Alan's jaw tightened. People had seen that moment. More people than he had realized. Back at the motel, Jillian closed the laptop. The room had grown quiet again. Sunlight now filled the parking lot outside the window. She rested her hand gently over her stomach. The baby shifted slightly. The movement felt grounding. Jillian had never imagined that the week would unfold this way. But now, the path ahead was becoming clearer. Documents were accumulating, facts were aligning, and the truth behind the loan denial was no longer a mystery. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford still believed the central problem was money. He believed that once he solved the financial pressure from the Midwest lender, everything else could return to normal. What he did not yet understand was that another kind of record now existed. Emails, bank statements, voicemails, each one quietly documenting a story very different from the one he had told inside the bank office. And those records were beginning to form a foundation stronger than any loan Alan had ever tried to secure. 2 weeks after Gillian Redford walked out of the bank lobby at First National Bank, the legal machinery that quietly governed financial truth had begun to move. It did not move loudly. There were no dramatic confrontations or sudden revelations. Instead, it moved through documents filings and official notices, each one creating a record that could not easily be ignored. That morning, Gillian sat in a quiet conference room inside the office of Daniel Harper, her estate attorney. It was the first time she had met him in person. The office was located in a modest legal building near downtown Cleveland, chosen simply because it allowed easier coordination with several financial institutions involved in Margaret Redford's estate. Daniel Harper was exactly as Gillian had imagined from their video calls. Calm, organized, precise. Rachel Simmons sat beside him at the conference table, reviewing a stack of financial statements. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows behind them. "Thank you for coming in today," Daniel said. Gillian nodded. "Of course." He opened a folder in front of him. The probate court in Santa Fe has completed the preliminary estate review. Rachel slid one of the documents toward Gillian. "This confirms that Margaret Redford's will has been validated and accepted." Gillian scanned the document briefly. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. The estate transfer process had officially begun, Daniel continued. "This allows the trust to begin releasing its first scheduled distribution." Rachel added gently, "The initial transfer will occur within the next few days." Gillian nodded slowly. She did not ask about the exact amount. Margaret had structured the trust carefully, and Gillian trusted the system her aunt had created. But Daniel was not finished. "There is another matter we should discuss." Gillian looked up. Daniel folded his hands. "Your marital situation." The word hung in the room quietly. Gillian did not react immediately. Daniel continued carefully. "You mentioned during our previous conversations that your husband asked you to leave your shared residence." "Yes." "And that the conflict began after the loan application was denied." "That's correct." Rachel glanced briefly at the folder Gillian had brought with her. Inside it were copies of the documents she had been gathering. Daniel spoke again. "If the situation escalates into a legal dispute, particularly regarding financial liability, it is important that you understand your position clearly." Gillian listened. "The inheritance from Margaret Redford," Daniel explained, "is legally protected under trust law. That means it cannot be claimed as marital debt collateral." Gillian felt a small sense of relief settle quietly inside her. "So the estate is separate?" "Completely separate," Daniel confirmed. Rachel added, "Even if your husband has outstanding business debts, they cannot attach to these assets." Gillian nodded slowly. That detail mattered. Daniel continued. "However, if there are financial misrepresentations involving shared marital accounts, those could become relevant in other legal contexts." Gillian opened the folders she had brought with her. Inside were printed copies of the evidence she had been collecting. She slid several pages across the table. Daniel examined them carefully. First came the bank confirmation email from Mark Caldwell. Then the financial transaction records showing payments to Midwest Commercial Lending Group. Finally, the printed email exchange between Alan and Gregory Shaw. Daniel read quietly. Rachel leaned slightly closer to see the details. Several minutes passed in silence. Finally, Daniel placed the documents down. "This is very significant." Rachel nodded in agreement. The email clearly states that the private loan needed to be disclosed during the bank application. Gillian spoke calmly. "He didn't disclose it." Daniel nodded. "And then blamed you when the loan was denied." "Yes." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "This pattern of documentation is extremely strong." Gillian waited. Daniel continued. "If your husband attempts to claim that the loan denial was caused by your actions, these records contradict that claim directly." Rachel added, especially the voicemail recording you mentioned. Jillian nodded. I have the file saved. Daniel smiled slightly. You've been very thorough. Jillian did not see it as thoroughness. It was simply the habit Margaret had taught her many years ago. Write things down, record the truth. Daniel closed the folder. For now, the most important thing is patience. Jillian looked at him. Why? Because the situation is already changing. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford was discovering exactly how much things had begun to change. He stood inside his office staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. The envelope bore the logo of Midwest Commercial Lending Group. The message inside was short. Formal notice of outstanding debt. The letter explained that if the loan balance was not addressed within 30 days, the lender would begin formal recovery procedures. Alan placed the letter on his desk. His frustration had begun to grow sharper. He had expected the bank rejection to be temporary. He had expected Jillian to return. He had expected everything to stabilize. Instead, nothing had moved the way he wanted. He picked up his phone and dialed Jillian again. Across the conference room, Jillian's phone vibrated quietly on the table. She glanced at the screen. Alan. Daniel noticed the name. You don't have to answer that. Jillian considered the phone for a moment, then she silenced it. Across town, Alan lowered the phone slowly after the call went unanswered. His patience was wearing thin. Back in Daniel Harper's office, Rachel gathered the documents neatly. Daniel looked at Jillian again. There's something important you should understand. Yes, situations like this often reveal a person's true priorities. Jillian said nothing. Daniel continued. Your husband's financial pressure will likely increase over the next few weeks. Jillian nodded. I expect that. And when pressure increases, Daniel said calmly, people often become careless. Yes, Jillian understood. Careless people made mistakes. Mistakes created evidence. And evidence had a way of telling the truth without anyone raising their voice. Outside the office window, the afternoon sunlight continued to brighten the streets of Cleveland. The city moved forward quietly. Alan Redford still believed the conflict with his wife was simply a disagreement waiting to be resolved. He believed time would restore the control he had always relied on. What he did not yet understand was that the balance of power had already shifted. Not through anger, not through revenge, but through documents law and the quiet patience of someone who knew how to wait for the truth to become undeniable. The following week arrived with a quiet shift in the rhythm of Jillian Redford's life. For the first time since she had left the house on Willow Creek Drive, the uncertainty that had surrounded her days began to settle into something clearer. Not victory, not even relief, just direction. The call from Daniel Harper came on a calm Tuesday morning. Jillian had just returned from a prenatal appointment at a nearby clinic when her phone vibrated in the passenger seat of her car. Jillian, Daniel said when she answered. His voice carried the same steady calm it always had. Yes, the probate court in Santa Fe has finalized the estate review. Jillian sat quietly for a moment. That was fast. Margaret's documentation was exceptionally organized, Daniel replied. There were no challenges to the will, and the court had no reason to delay the process. He paused briefly. The first trust disbursement has now been authorized. Jillian felt her grip tighten slightly around the steering wheel. Authorized, yes. Rachel Simmons joined the call a moment later. The initial transfer from the trust will appear in the designated account within the next 24 hours. Jillian did not speak immediately, not because she was shocked, but because the moment carried a quiet weight. Margaret's voice returned again in her memory. The resources I leave behind are meant to protect your freedom. Rachel continued explaining. This first disbursement includes the liquid investment portion Margaret designated for immediate stability. Jillian nodded slowly. I understand. Daniel spoke again. The Santa Fe property will transfer officially after the final paperwork is filed, but legally the estate is now yours. Jillian thanked them both before ending the call. For a moment she remained sitting in the parked car. Cars moved past on the street. A woman walked her dog along the sidewalk. The world looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. But something fundamental had changed. Later that afternoon, Jillian logged into the secure banking portal Daniel had arranged for the trust account. The screen loaded slowly. Then the numbers appeared. Available balance $2, 400,000. It was only the first portion of Margaret's estate. But it was more than enough to ensure one thing. Jillian would never again be financially dependent on Alan Redford. Across Cleveland, Alan's week had taken a very different direction. Inside the office of Redford Structural Services, the tension had become impossible to ignore. 2 construction contracts had been delayed because suppliers were waiting for payment confirmations. The email from Midwest Commercial Lending Group had grown more direct. And the phone calls from Gregory Shaw had become less patient. Alan sat at his desk staring at the stack of invoices in front of him. The numbers refused to align the way they once had. The expansion loan had been the solution. Without it, the business was now balancing on thinner margins than he liked to admit. Alan picked up his phone again. He dialed Jillian's number. This time, she answered. Hello? Her voice was calm. Alan exhaled slowly. Jillian, we need to talk again. What about the business? There was a brief pause on the line. What about it? Alan tried to keep his tone steady. I'm dealing with the Midwest lender right now. They're asking for repayment, and I need time to restructure things. Jillian waited. Alan continued. If we present a stronger financial position, I can reapply for bank financing. And how do you plan to do that? Another pause. Then Alan said the words he had been avoiding. I need your help. Across town, Jillian stood by the window of the motel room as she listened. The sky outside had begun to turn orange with the early evening light. What kind of help, she asked. Alan hesitated. Financial support? The honesty arrived reluctantly. I thought you said the business liabilities were manageable. They are, Alan replied quickly. But the timeline has changed. Jillian did not interrupt. Alan continued speaking. If we stabilize things for a few months, the company will recover. And you believe I should invest in that recovery, yes? Jillian looked out at the fading sunlight. Alan, yes. Do you remember what you said at the bank? There was silence. Then he sighed. I already told you that was frustration. You said I didn't belong in your house. That wasn't what I meant. That's what you said. Alan ran a hand through his hair, pacing his office again. Look, we both know things got out of control. Jillian spoke quietly. The bank didn't deny the loan because of me. Alan said nothing. I have the documentation, she continued, the undisclosed Midwest loan. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Finally, Alan spoke again, his voice lower now. Where did you get that information? It doesn't matter. But it did matter, because the truth was now written down. Emails, bank records, voicemail. Alan leaned against the edge of his desk. For the first time since the argument at the bank, he felt something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Jillian continued calmly. You asked me to leave the house. That was temporary. Temporary decisions can have permanent consequences. Alan did not answer. Across the motel room, Jillian rested her hand gently over her stomach. I'm not coming back to Willow Creek Drive, she said. Alan's voice rose slightly. So that's it. You're just walking away now. What does that mean? It means I'm moving forward. The words were not dramatic. They carried no anger, only clarity. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford stood alone in his office staring at the silent phone after the call ended. For the first time, he realized something he had never seriously considered before. Jillian Redford no longer needed anything from him. Not a house, not financial support, not approval. The balance he had always assumed would remain in his favor had shifted quietly while he was busy protecting his pride. And the woman he had dismissed in a bank lobby now possessed something far stronger than revenge. Freedom. Early summer arrived quietly in Cleveland. The maple tree outside the house on Willow Creek Drive had grown full with leaves again, casting soft shade across the quiet street. Neighbors walked their dogs in the evenings. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalk. From the outside, the neighborhood looked unchanged. But inside one particular house, the silence had become permanent. Alan Redford still lived there. The same beige siding, the same kitchen table where he had once spread construction blueprints across the surface and talked about expansion. But the house no longer felt like the center of his plans. Several weeks had passed since the conversation with Jillian that ended with a simple sentence. "I'm moving forward." At first, Alan had assumed it was temporary. He believed Jillian would eventually return after emotions settled. But time had quietly proven otherwise. Legal notices began arriving, not dramatic ones, just formal correspondence, a separation filing, requests for financial disclosure, letters from attorneys that spoke in calm, structured language rather than accusation. Each document reminded Alan that the situation was no longer a private argument between two people. It had become a legal record. Inside the office of Daniel Harper, Jillian Redford signed the final paperwork that morning. The conference room looked almost identical to the one she had visited weeks earlier. The same wooden table, the same tall windows, but the folder in front of her now contained documents that formally ended the marriage. Daniel reviewed the final page. "This confirms the separation agreement and property boundaries," he said. Rachel Simmons sat quietly beside him, reviewing the estate documents. "The trust accounts remain entirely separate assets," she added. Jillian nodded. She signed her name slowly and clearly. The pen moved smoothly across the paper, not rushed, not hesitant, just finished. Daniel collected the documents and placed them neatly back into the folder. "It's done," he said. Jillian did not smile, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. Outside the building, the afternoon sun warmed the pavement. Cleveland moved forward with the quiet energy of early summer. Later that day, Jillian returned once more to Maple Grove Motel. Her suitcase stood open on the bed. But this time, it was not because she had nowhere else to go. It was because she was leaving. The Santa Fe property Margaret had left her had been fully transferred the previous week. Rachel Simmons had arranged the travel details. The house had been maintained carefully by a local property service during the estate process. Everything was ready. Jillian folded the last few pieces of clothing into the suitcase. Her leather notebook rested on the desk beside the window. She opened it one final time in that room. The pages held the quiet record of everything that had happened over the past 2 months. The bank meeting, Alan's words, the voicemail, the emails, the legal confirmations. Every moment written clearly. She turned to the final page and wrote one last line. "Leaving Cleveland. Beginning next chapter." Then she closed the notebook. Across Cleveland, Alan Redford sat inside the same living room where he had once believed his future was secure. The television flickered quietly, though he was not watching it. The house felt larger now, too large. The construction company still existed, but the expansion plans had been abandoned. Several projects had been sold to other contractors in order to manage the debt from Midwest Commercial Lending Group. Alan had solved the immediate financial crisis, but the cost had been higher than he expected. The phone on the coffee table buzzed once. A message from Tom Whitaker. "Tom, haven't seen you around much lately. Everything all right?" Alan stared at the message for a moment. Then he set the phone down without answering. Some conversations no longer felt necessary. Far away, the desert air of Santa Fe, New Mexico, carried a completely different rhythm. The sky stretched wide and clear above the red hills surrounding Margaret Redford's old home. Jillian stood on the veranda of the adobe house, watching the evening light settle across the landscape. The property looked exactly as she remembered it from childhood. Juniper trees, the low stone wall, the quiet wind moving through the desert grass. Inside the house, Margaret's books still filled the shelves. The same cedar scent lingered in the air. Jillian rested her hand gently over her stomach again. The baby moved softly beneath her palm. Soon a new life would begin here, a quieter one, not built around proving anything to anyone, just built around stability, truth, and freedom. She walked inside and placed her suitcase beside the wooden table near the window. Her leather notebook rested there as well. For a moment she considered opening it again, but there was nothing left to record. The story had already been written, and the most important part of it had never required shouting revenge or humiliation. It had only required patience. Margaret had been right. A calm mind sees what chaos tries to hide. Outside, the desert sky slowly turned gold, then deep blue as evening settled over Santa Fe. And Gillian Redford, finally free of the life she had quietly endured, stepped forward into a future that belonged entirely to her. In life, there are moments when people mistake silence for weakness. They assume that the quiet person in the room has nothing to say, nothing to prove, nothing to change. But sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is observation. It is the patience to let truth reveal itself through records, through actions, through time. Gillian Redford never shouted in the bank lobby. She never tried to humiliate the man who humiliated her. She simply paid attention. She wrote things down. And when the truth finally stood on its own, she walked away with something far more powerful than revenge. She walked away with a dignity. Stories like this remind us that strength does not always look dramatic. Sometimes strength looks like restraint, like patience, like the courage to leave quietly when staying would mean losing yourself. If this story stayed with you, feel free to leave a comment and share where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel and the different places people listen from. And if you appreciate stories about quiet resilience, truth, and justice that unfold slowly rather than loudly, you're welcome to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thank you for listening to this story.